Could God actually be evil? That is the subject for today's video. I've got Dr. Perry Hendricks right below me and then Dr. Justin Mooney diagonal from me. Both of these guys actually published a paper recently on the Evil God Challenge. What we're actually doing is a response to Alex O'Connor. Let me go ahead and pull him up here so we can see his beautiful face. Alex O'Connor published this video 3 years ago, 345,000 views. It's titled, Could God Be Evil? Let's begin.
If God exists, he is perfectly good. This is the position of traditional monotheisms, such as Christianity. Not only does a supernatural creator exist, but he is maximally good and cares about you and me on a personal, moral level. But there's a famous problem with this view called the problem of evil. If an all-powerful God exists who is capable of eliminating all the evil in the world, then why doesn't he? Why does evil exist? Why do people get cancer and murder each other and put pineapple on pizza? The atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie.
So I thought that was actually a good little, joke in there. Perry, what are your thoughts?
Weak joke. Low hanging
Okay,
fruit.
well, first of all, do you like pineapple on pizza? Is that why you're calling it a weak joke? What's happening?
I don't like pineapple because I'm a normal human being. And so therefore I don't like it on pizza, but I mean, there is way better things to go with than that.
Okay, name one.
Okay. Something that's really evil is, there was actually, like, I was reading the other day in the paper about this woman who fell in a well, and she was stuck down there for hours. And there was like some fire trucks and they eventually pulled her out and she had a bunch of broken ribs. And they were trying to figure out why the woman fell down the well. And it turns out she just couldn't see that well.
I've heard you use that one before, so I'm not impressed.
How is that better than Alex's? It's not, Perry. Now I've got Justin to back me up here. So
it's just the accent that's catching you there.
It's that, and also the baby face. Like he's got this like thick beard. Well, I guess as thick as he can grow one. But yeah, he's just a handsome man. All right, let's
not off to a good start with that.
No, this is a great start. This is a great start to this video. All right, let's keep going.
He famously concluded that since if a good God existed, he would want to remove all evil and would have the power to do so. The existence of evil in the world therefore shows that a good God doesn't exist. Okay, you probably already know this, but here's something for your attention. Religious believers have many, many ways in which they respond to the problem of evil and defend the idea that a good God exists despite the existence of evil. Call this the good God hypothesis. Religious defenses of the...
Or just theism.
Right.
Yeah.
The existence of a good God in response to the problem of evil are sometimes called theodicies and include arguments like evil is necessary to obtain higher order goods, or evil exists due to human free will, things like this.
Do you want to pause here and talk about anything that he's said so far, definitions or the examples of the theodicies?
I mean, so far he's just reviewing background to the Evil God Challenge that we're going to be talking about, and I think Perry, let me know if you disagree, but I think everything he said so far sounds right to me. Like, he hasn't given any incorrect definitions or anything like that. He cites that Mackey paper from the 1950s, which is very influential. Maybe one thing to note that's just not super important, but just kind of a historical point, is that the argument he attributes to Mackey is much older than Mackey. Like Hume was citing citing Epicurus on this argument way back, in Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. And of course, Epicurus is much older than Hume. So the argument in some form or other has been around for a long time, but a lot of people cite that Mackey paper as like the sort of, the definitive, like final and sort of contemporary defense of that version of the argument from evil.
Anything to add, Perry?
No. I agree with Justin, and that's basically accurate.
Cool. All right, let's continue.
But today, I want to show you why most theodicies that the religious put forward to defend the good God hypothesis can actually be reversed and used with equal plausibility to prove that if God exists, he is in fact maximally evil. And we can call this the evil God hypothesis. Now, hold on though, this is ridiculous. Obviously, God can't be maximally evil. That's a ludicrous suggestion. Clearly, the world could be worse than it is, and a maximally evil God would make it worse. And clearly, there's so much good in the world as well. Beauty and love and laughter, things that a maximally evil God wouldn't allow to exist. It should be obvious that these everyday observations are incompatible with a totally evil, omnipotent being. Just look around, see all the good in the world, and you'll see how ridiculous it is to suggest that God is maximally evil. But that's kind of the point. Most religious believers immediately reject the evil God hypothesis based on these kinds of simple observations. But if the religious can...
Maybe I'll pause it there because, Perry, I know you do have some thoughts on this. I mean, I too, like, the first time I heard Dr. Stephen Law explain the evil God challenge, I was like, is that really what people say in response to the evil God hypothesis, that there's too much good in the world? Maybe that is what a lot of people think, but that's not what I thought. What, Perry? Yeah, take it away.
Yeah, I don't understand where people are getting that from. I don't know why anyone thinks that that's why people dismiss maltheism, by which I mean the view that God, that an omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly evil being exists. I've never met anyone. I've asked quite a few people why they think maltheism is false. No one's ever said that. I don't know who Law and O'Connor are talking to. I don't claim that my sample is representative, but like, I don't understand why anyone would think that's why maltheism is false. I don't think the problem of good is a good argument against maltheism either. And I don't understand why anyone would. So yeah, I hear it said a lot that that's why theists dismiss maltheism, but I've never actually seen it in person or in print. And I just don't understand why people are saying that.
What about you, Justin? I mean, is that also in your experience? Like, it just seems kind of strange that's. I mean, if I remember correctly, I think Law does mention that he asks students that he's teaching, and that's their response. I think I remember him saying something along those lines. So maybe that's true. Like if we're asking college students. Justin, what about you though?
Yeah. So I haven't gone around asking lots of people this question, but as far as what I think, it's not what I would say. It's not like my main move here is to, oh, well, there's so much good in the world, therefore there's no evil God. In fact, I actually think, and this is one thing I wondered about with this clip, he says, isn't it just ridiculous to think that there's an evil God? That's not clear to me. I don't think it's ridiculous to think that there's an evil God. I think it's false, and there are reasons to think that it's false that are pretty good. But ridiculous is like, thinking the earth is flat or something like that. I think that I'm not sure I would place evil God on that level. And you might even think that that's, a lesson for the theist to take away from the evil God challenge, even if they're not fully persuaded by it, is that, well, the evil God hypothesis is not as crazy as you might at first think, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah. All right, let's continue here.
Say, look at how much good there is in the world. This disproves the evil God hypothesis. Why can't the atheist say, look how much evil there is in the world? This disproves the good God hypothesis. Well, as I say, the religious can use theodicies, philosophical arguments to reconcile the existence of evil with a good God. But what if these same theodicies work in reverse and can also reconcile the existence of good with an evil God? Well, it would mean that the religious believer has no more reason, absent other factors, to suggest that their God is good than they do to suggest that their God is evil. And so, unknowingly, by responding to the problem of evil with theodicies, the religious are simultaneously using arguments that just as validly support the existence of an evil God. This is the problem posed by the Oxford philosopher Dr. Stephen Law in his 2010 paper, The Evil God Challenge. Most theists say that the idea of a good God is far more reasonable than the idea of an evil God, But if the arguments for defending the first work just as well in defending the latter, then they're unjustified in claiming that the good God hypothesis is more rational than the evil God hypothesis.
Okay, let's pause there, because I think it'd be good to talk about, maybe flesh out some of the theodicies a little bit more, and then get some examples of how Law and Alex, I think later in the clip he tries to show how they can be reversed. But let's turn over to you, Perry, and get some more thoughts on the theodicies that Law often will appeal to and say, well, we can actually flip this around and use it as a sort of defense of maltheism. So let's talk about this reversing type thing that he claims can happen. And then I've got another question that I'll ask after that.
So one example that is used often is free will theodicy, although I'm not sure how too often. It's often said that it's used often, but I'm not sure how many people endorse it. Theists might say something like, look, the reason why there's certain kinds of evil in the world are because God desired to create these creatures with this kind of morally significant freedom, because these kinds of creatures are really valuable, really good. But if you create beings that have this kind of freedom, it means that you have to allow that they perform some evil actions. And so this explains why there are certain kinds of evil in the world. It doesn't explain all of it, but it explains some of it. And then a maltheist might say, whoa, why can't we just say something like this, like to account for all the good in the world? We could say, well, evil God wants there to be more creatures that have morally significant free will, because, these kinds of creatures, when they perform evil actions, it's even better than if evil God were to determine that they did, or cause them to do it in a way that they lacked freedom. If they cause evil out of their own free choice, it's even worse, and therefore it makes the world worse. And that's why evil God is going to want to create these creatures, and that's why we have all this good in the world, because he has to allow, if he's making these free creatures, he has to allow them to have true freedom, which involves the freedom to do good things. And so the thought is that those two theodicies are equally plausible. And so if the free will theodicy has any merit to it, so does the free will theodicy on behalf of the maltheist.
Anything to add, Justin? Or I felt like that was a pretty good explanation.
Yeah, it's a good example. And I don't know if we need to go through, all of the theodicies that Alex and Stephen Law talk about, but that's a good example of the strategy here to say, like, look, this hypothesis that there's a good God, one problem with it is it seems like there's a lot of evil in the world, and then the free will theodicy is an attempt to explain why a good God would allow the evil in the world. And then the thought is, well, you can just flip it around and say there's a version of the free will theodicy that you can use to explain why an evil God would allow all the good in the world, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's just like this reversal strategy. I mean, one thing to point out, since Perry mentioned, like, a lot of people say that lots of people endorse the free will theodicy, but it's unclear whether that's really true. So I try to keep updated a huge bibliography of contemporary work on the problem of evil. There's a link to it on the research page of my website. And so that bibliography, it's I'm constantly adding to it as new stuff gets published or I find new things. But the largest section of that bibliography is on free will defenses and free will theodicies. So there's a ton of stuff written about them, but a lot of it is critical. So as opposed to like people criticizing them as opposed to supporting them. So Perry's right. It's a little bit unclear like how much support does this view actually have. It does, though, get lots of discussion. More so than any other approach to theodicy in the contemporary literature. One of the other theodicies... Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, were you going to give another example of like another theodicy that can be reversed?
Yeah, I was thinking... So Alex talks about two others. One is this higher order goods theodicy, and the examples he uses are virtues. And so it might be that he and Law would think of the soul building theodicy as an example of a higher order goods theodicy. And then he also talks about the the appreciation theodicy, which is like, look, we need evil as a contrast in order to appreciate good. And one thing to note about these is the soul-building theodicy is another influential one in contemporary literature. Lots of people talk about it. At least some people seriously defend it. The appreciation theodicy, as far as I can tell, basically no one talks about. I know of one paper out of everything that's been written since the 1950s on the problem of evil about that theodicy. And I don't know whether it's supportive of it or not. I haven't actually read the paper, but there's only one that I know of that's even about that theodicy. It's something I think you hear a lot more in classrooms than from professional philosophers. It's one thing I all the time when I teach the problem of evil.
That is weird.
A lot of time, undergraduates will bring up the appreciation theodicy, but it's not really something that philosophers seem to be interested in.
Well, the question I was going to ask is, what is the relevance of flipping the theodicies or being able to reverse them? Just trying to get our heads around, like, why is this even important? Why are they? Yeah, why is this an important thing that's part of this argument?
So part of the Evil God Challenge. Do you want? I'll explain it in a little bit. I think we were going to wait till the end of his explanation, but one part of it is you want to say that the problem of good, which is the problem of reconciling the existence of evil God with the amount, intensity, distribution of good in the world. And the claim is that the problem of good is roughly equally as strong as the problem of evil. That's a key part of the Evil God Challenge. And so one part of showing that is to show that theodicies that can be used on behalf of theism can also be used, changed or reversed and used on behalf of monotheism. So in order to show that they're roughly equally strong arguments, part of what you got to do is show that the theodicies cut both ways.
Well, so what happens though if the theist or Christian or whoever accepts that these theodicies can be reversed? What are they then committed to, according to Stephen?
Well, okay, let me. Maybe I should just explain it. The evil God. Let me give an overview so that you can kind of see where this is going, because there's two parts to it. So the first part,
I mean, we could save it for because we're going to get to the problem summarized, so we could just wait till then. If you want to, we could just continue playing the clip. I just wanted to give people like maybe a little idea right now of like why we're even talking about this.
Okay, let's put it this way. There's two stages of an Evil God Challenge, or two initial stages of it. And one of these stages, is that the problem of good and the problem of evil are roughly equally strong. And your question was, what happens if you grant that they're equally strong?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you need the other stage to make the full point there. But we can say something like this. Initially, you might think if the problem of good is a really strong argument against monotheism, then you should think that the problem of evil is a really strong argument against theism. If, the theodicies work both ways. That's the general thought that's lurking behind there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot that can be said in response to that, right? But that's the sort of point that he wants people to get to.
Yeah, you might be skeptical that that relevant theodicies can be reversed. You might think, I don't know, Justin, what do you think about this? Do you think the deontological theodicies by like Eric Rishin, or is it, I don't know how to say his name, Eric R, can be reversed? Do you think that's plausible?
Potentially.
Well, that was actually a question, because you went to a specific one, a specific theodicy that you wanted to ask Justin to see if it could be reversed, but that was a more general question that I had, and maybe Justin, you can answer this one instead. And if you want, you can talk about that theodicy. But I was going to ask at some point during the stream, like, what are there any theodicies in your mind that can't be reversed in that way?
Yeah. So this question about like the deontological theodicies, like Reeton's. So Reeton's deontological theodicy is a free will theodicy. And so you might think it will be reversible, but maybe, Perry, is your thought that, well, look, deontological theodicies are theodicies basically that say that God allows some evil because, for whatever reason, fill out the story however you want, there's like a duty for God to do so. And you might think, well, evil God isn't worried about respecting whatever duties evil God might have, because evil God is evil, not moral. Is that the thought?
That's one of the thoughts. There's a few things that, yeah, but that's one of them. That's that's kind of what I was thinking about it.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing that's worth exploring. And more generally, Cameron, the question of, are there theodicies that are not reversible, I think is an important question that could be explored almost endlessly, because although there are at least these three types of theodicy that Alex talks about in the video and that Law has talked about, there are many, many others as well. I mean, the number of theodicies that have been developed over the years, and not just within the Christian tradition, but also within like Jewish, Islamic, and Hindu traditions, is vast. And it would take a ton of work to show that that all of them are plausibly reversible in the way that Law wants to say that they are.
And that is a key part of the argument. Yeah. Well, let's just continue. Things will become more clear. I'll just say this real quick, and then Perry, you can come in. Things will become a little bit clearer as we go on, because one of the clips that we're reviewing is where Alex kind of summarizes the argument, and then he passes it over to Dr. Law to basically give his summary of the argument also. And so we're going to be able to understand what the argument is in a much fuller way in just a little bit. And then also, like the whole point of this stream is that there's a new response to the evil God challenge that we haven't even talked about yet, that we're getting to toward the end of this. So you want to definitely stay tuned. But Perry, what were you going to say?
I was going to say there's at least one theodicy that it's really difficult to see how you could reverse. I can't remember if Law notes this in his paper. He might, but the Felix Culpa theodicy is really difficult to see how you could reverse. Of course, very few people endorse it. So maybe, Law and Alex would be like, well, who cares? But nevertheless, there's at least one that seems pretty difficult to reverse.
Well, I mean, you mentioned it, but I'm sure the audience, not everyone's going to know what the Felix Culpa theodicy is. Just quick overview of what that theodicy says.
So briefly, it goes something like this. If God exists, he's going to create one of the best possible worlds. Worlds in which God becomes incarnate and atones for the sins of humans or whoever, are the best kinds of worlds. It's such a valuable thing. It can't be surpassed in any other way. And so we would think that we can expect the world to have this kind of sin and evil in it, because worlds in which God becomes incarnate and atones are going to be worlds that are fallen and have these bad kinds of things. So it's difficult to see how you could reverse that. This is not to endorse it as being plausible, although it's not crazy. But yeah, that's.
But it is hard to see how it could be reversed. Yeah. Let's continue the video here. We've got, it looks like, another minute or so of this initial introduction to the argument, and then we're going to get to the summary, which I think is going to help kind of put it all together for us. So let's just continue where we left off.
Here's the crux of Stephen Law's argument. He doesn't try to prove or disprove the existence of any god, good or evil, and he doesn't pass judgment on whether religious theodicies are successful. He just says that if the religious easily dismiss the evil god hypothesis because of the existence of good, they should just as easily dismiss the good god hypothesis because of the existence of evil. But if the religious think that theodicies can defend the good God hypothesis against evil, then they should also think that these same theodicies can defend the evil God hypothesis against good. He says, and I quote, "Theists typically dismiss the evil God hypothesis out of hand because of the problem of good. There is surely..."
Which, again, that first sentence here that he's got highlighted is the one that we talked about toward the beginning of the show. Theists typically dismiss, but who are these people that are doing this typically? It's an interesting question. I don't know what the answer to that is.
Yeah, too much good in the world for it to be the creation of such a being. But then why doesn't the problem of evil provide equally good grounds for dismissing belief in a good God? Okay, so to understand this challenge properly, because it might well...
Oh, that's the end of the introduction. So then he does attempt to explain a little bit more, but we're going to skip forward because we got two experts on the problem. We're going to skip forward to the his summary of the argument at the end, and then we'll maybe add on just anything else that we need to. So let's do that. Skipping toward, I think, 12 minute 40 seconds of Alex's video.
Of comparison. So what does this all show? Well, it shows that if you're a religious believer who thinks that these kinds of theodicies work to rationalize the existence of a good God, you should be aware that they work equally well to rationalize the existence of an evil God, as I've just.
Well, and then, I mean, just wanted to kind of reiterate that relies on the claim that you can reverse all of the theodicies, right? That's part of the claim that Alex is explaining here from Stephen Law's paper. And so that is what we were kind of just talking about, where it's not really clear that can be done. So, in that this argument does rely on that assumption. So, yeah, important to point out.
Shown. And if you're convinced that the good God hypothesis is far more rational than the evil God hypothesis, you'd better find a special reason to justify this position.
See, that's actually the thing that we're going to be talking about in just a few minutes. So
I wouldn't say the reason's special, but it is a reason. Just an ordinary
Unless
one.
you're willing to.
What'd you say? You said it's just an ordinary one? It's not a special one?
Reason. Nothing special.
Okay, Perry. Okay.
Grant that both hypotheses are equally plausible, you shouldn't so easily dismiss an evil God because of the problem of good, if you're not also willing to dismiss a good God because of the problem of evil. Now, to be clear, I'm not trying to argue that an evil God actually exists, or even that these theodicies are bad theodicies. I'm just trying to say that if you think these theodicies succeed in defending a good God against evil, you should think they work equally well to defend an evil God against good. And I'm pretty sure that this is all Stephen Law is saying too. I mean, I don't know that, I'm not Stephen Law, but Stephen Law is Stephen Law, so why don't we ask him?
The theist.
Okay, here we go. We're about to get Stephen Law here. But you guys have any other thoughts on that little clip of the summary?
Yeah, it's true that Stephen Law is Stephen Law.
That much is incontestable. Let's hear what Stephen Law, his summary here, and then we can chat for a bit.
Okay.
This typically has a kind of belief system.
Let me scoot back a little bit so we can hear him start.
The theist typically has a kind of belief system put together with various arguments for defensive moves and so on. And it's striking to what extent you can build a very similar kind of belief system around another core belief that there's an evil God, which the theist will typically reject as absolutely absurd. And really the point is this, that they're right. It is. It is completely absurd.
Right.
Notwithstanding all of the clever, convoluted maneuvers that I might engage in order to defend this belief system, their first impression is completely correct. It's ludicrous. You need only look out the window to see that this is not the creation of a supremely powerful and malevolent deity. And if that is true of an evil God, then it can be true of a good God too.
And for this argument to...
It almost sounds like this is his view, and then he's saying that this is, because it's his view, it's then therefore the typical view.
Yes, yeah, so he definitely.
Am I making a bad inference here?
No, I think that's right. I think Stephen Law does seem to think that the problem of good is a decisive argument against monotheism.
I think that's probably true. You certainly get that impression, but he does seem to be careful to claim, that, this is what theists think, right? And whether he's right about that is another question, but anyway. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's continue then. We'll just play the rest of this clip, and then we'll get to this new response that we've kind of been setting up this whole time.
You don't actually need to offer any analysis of whether the religious theodicies, the defenses against the problem of evil, are good or bad. You don't comment on whether they're good or bad. You just say, if you believe these and if you think that they're sound, if you think that they work, you should be aware that they also work just as well to defend the hypothesis that God is maximally evil. And if you find that ridiculous, maybe you should question the theodicy in the first place.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
My thanks, of course.
All right, that's it. That's the whole thing. So where should we begin? Now, you guys have recently written a paper, which basically argues that there's a new. This is not a new argument. That's kind of the whole idea, is that the evil God challenge is not anything new. It's actually really, really old. but it's just a specific version of a sort of old argument. And this is all going to be very, very important and relevant. You even talk about that, I think, in the conclusion of the paper, how the reason why this is important, because there's actually a whole lot of other responses that aren't necessarily responses to the evil God challenge, but nevertheless become relevant because this argument, the evil God challenge, is actually probably best categorized under this category of what we call, or what you guys call, what all philosophers call, the so-called gap problem. So let's unpack it. Let's do it. Who wants to begin?
Well, can let me give a brief overview of this evil God challenge, because part of it that neither Alex and Stephen didn't discuss, but Stephen discusses it in his paper, and it'll be important for what we're talking about. But the way that I see the evil God challenge is there are basically two stages to start. The first stage, which they don't talk about, is that there's supposed to be an evidential parity between theism and maltheism. So the thought is that in addition to their claim that any theodicy can be reversed, it's also supposed to be true that arguments for theism are going to equally support maltheism. So if you get an argument from design, it gets you to a designer, but doesn't tell you whether anything about the moral character of the designer. Or if you use a cosmological argument, it's going to get you to a necessary being. Maybe it's omnipotent, but it's not going to conclude that it's morally good. Or if you have a moral argument, it might get you to a foundation of morality, but it doesn't tell you whether it's a good or an evil foundation. So that's stage one, is showing that there's an evidential parity between theism and maltheism. Of course, that's going to be tough to do. There are a lot of arguments to go over and think about whether they can be equally used to support maltheism in addition to theism. But that's stage one. Stage two from after that is to say that the problem of evil and the problem of good are roughly equally strong, and that'll be for the reasons we talked about earlier. But then from here, the evil God challenge, the proponent of that challenge has kind of two options. One have both been taken. One option is to say something like, well, okay, so theism and maltheism are roughly evidentially on an evidential par, and the problem of good and problem of evil are roughly equally strong, so why should we think God is good? Give us a reason to think that. And then the second route you can take is to say, okay, well, theism and maltheism are on an evidential par. The problem of good and the problem of evil are roughly equally strong, and the problem of good is decisive evidence against maltheism. But since the problem of evil is, by stipulation, equally strong as the problem of good, the problem of evil should be decisive evidence against theism. Those are the two sort of ways that the challenge can run. And maybe someone could think of a third way, but those are the two ways that I've seen discussed.
And the first one seems a little bit more modest because it's not claiming that we should reject either theism or maltheism. The second one is saying, well, we should just kind of reject both hypotheses. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Justin, did you want to add anything there to sort of clarify?
No, that sounds good to me. But do you want me to jump into our response?
Yes. And you know what? I'd like to actually kind of talk about like how this came about, because I think that, Justin, you said, maybe you mentioned it in like a Facebook post, that you actually have thought for a long time that the Evil God Challenge just was a version of this so-called gap problem. Yes. Right. And then you realized apparently like no one else had made this connection, or at least it hadn't been made academically in literature or anything like that. Yeah. Maybe other people did make the connection, but it just hasn't been talked about yet. So right. Maybe talk a little bit about how it came about, and then let's get into it.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So for a very long time, for about as long as there have been arguments for the existence of God, there has been this thing that nowadays is sometimes called the gap problem. And that's the problem of getting from the conclusion that there's some kind of a creator or first cause or designer of the universe to the further position that a lot of theists want to take. Well, that all theists, I guess, want to take, which is that God, that the cause of the universe, in addition to being something like a necessary or eternal being or a first cause, has all of the traditional divine attributes, is all powerful, all knowing, perfectly good, right? And so there's this problem of, well, how do we jump that gap from a cause of the universe to an all powerful, all knowing, perfectly good cause of the universe, right? And this problem's been around for a very long time, and there's a lot of work that's been written on it. And I think that some of the solutions or attempts to bridge that gap, which have been developed, are plausible. And so I am not super worried about this problem. It seems like there's been some good progress made on it. Now, this paper by Stephen Law that introduced the Evil God Challenge, it was in Alex's video. It came out in 2010. And
let me do this real quick, just to kind of let the audience know about what we're going to talk about. So toward the end of the show, we're going to actually talk about, kind of come back to the gap problem and discuss some of those reasons to think that the gap problem has been solved, or at least some of the attempts. And then we'll talk about Justin's sort of favorite responses, favorite fillers of the gap, so to speak. So we are going to talk about that, because I know a lot of you that are watching right now are like, what are those, right? What are those arguments that solve the gap problem? And so we will talk about those. We'll kind of talk about like the most important papers that have been developed that supposedly solve the gap problem. So we will get to that. Stay tuned, but let's get back to the Evil God Challenge.
Perfect. Yeah. So the Evil God Challenge, came out in 2010 with that paper, and then sort of gradually it looks like more people began to engage with it, and now there's like this burgeoning literature where a lot of people have interacted with. A lot of people replied to the challenge, but also a couple of other people have followed Stephen Law in defending it. And all the while that this is happening, I'm kind of like, noticing that this literature is growing, but not really engaging with it, not even really reading it. Because for a long time, I really wasn't that interested. And that's because I could see what the gist of the problem was. And from the very beginning, it struck me that this is just a version of the gap problem. The gap problem that has been around for centuries, even millennia, and that there's already a ton of work on. And so it seemed to me like this is just old news. This is, it's not, some shocking new argument that's a challenge for the theist. It's just a slightly, I think the way we put it in the paper is it's like a repackaging of an old idea. Well, eventually, it occurred to me that point might actually be worth publishing, because I noticed that it seemed like other people either weren't making this connection, or, as you said, were at least not publishing this connection. But I still didn't want to read all the literature on the Evil God Challenge. I had other projects that I needed to focus on. So I went to Perry, and I was like, Perry, you know this literature, because Perry's published on this topic before, so he knows what's going on. And I talked him into writing this paper with me. So we wrote up this paper that just says, roughly, look, the Evil God Challenge, this is rough, but the Evil God Challenge is basically just a version of this older gap problem. And for that reason, all of the solutions to the gap problem that theists have developed over the years are potentially well, actually, not just potential, they just are also responses to the Evil God Challenge. And that's interesting because until this was pointed out, right, it might look like, oh, okay, we've got, say 8 to 10 people who have explicitly responded to the Evil God Challenge, and these are their responses. Okay, well, that's good. But as soon as you realize that the Evil God Challenge is basically an instance of the gap problem, well, there's all these other solutions to the gap problem out there that suddenly you realize, oh, those are also additional responses to the Evil God. So there's more responses to it than it might appear.
So first of all, Perry, you're familiar with the Evil God Challenge. Why hadn't this occurred to you?
I'm an idiot. The very first paper I ever published was on the Evil God Challenge, actually. And then I published another one on it, but yeah, I just didn't make the connection.
It's no slight against you. Justin's a pretty smart guy. So what occurs to him, not necessarily going to occur to everyone.
Well, it's also true that philosophy is just, very complicated, and there are lots of conceptual connections between different ideas, and every philosopher sees some and not others, and that's why it's important that there's not just one philosopher, Oh,
I was gonna say this, Justin. So the title for you when I put you full screen was hippo enthusiast. Can we explain what that means for the audience?
Oh, well, it means, surprisingly enough, that I am a hippo enthusiast. I just really like hippopotamuses. They are my favorite animal, and actually, this summer, I'm flying to South Africa for my honeymoon to see hippos in the wild. So it should be life-changing for me.
It's going to be wild.
Wow.
It's going to be wild.
Are you gonna like stay a safe distance away because they're pretty dangerous?
Yeah, they are very dangerous. I will try to control myself and stay a safe distance.
Okay, please do. Because isn't it a fact that hippos kill more people than sharks every year? I think there's like a lot more people are killed by hippos.
Yes. Yes, that's right.
I think there's only like a dozen that get killed by sharks, and there's like 200 that get killed by hippos. I don't know if that's accurate, but
yeah, no, I've seen different estimates, and sometimes quite wildly different estimates for hippos, but it's at least a few hundred a year, I think.
But hippos are super cute, though. I mean, every time we go to the zoo, yeah, I love seeing, especially the baby hippos. The baby hippos are super duper cute.
Especially baby pygmy hippos. So like the pygmy hippo is the smaller species of hippo. It's like the size of a pig when it's full grown. Baby pygmy hippos, just look up YouTube videos of baby pygmy hippos. It is the most adorable thing on the face of the earth.
Yeah, and an evil god definitely wouldn't create those animals,
Correct.
Right? Decisive proof against maltheism right here. You guys saw it.
I want to make Justin is a hippo enthusiast. I'm like hippo tolerant. They're okay, nothing to write home about.
Okay, so this is the debate we should have had. Like I should have scheduled a debate between you guys on, are hippos good or are they bad?
Hippo, yeah. I was gonna say though, so one interesting thing is that Justin and I's paper is something like, well, all these people writing on the Evil God Challenge are just wasting their time. But that's not exactly right, because I think it's plausible. So one, the Evil God Challenge can be a way to sort of nicely get somebody to see the gap problem. It's a kind of nice motivator. It makes it easier to understand. So it's a good teaching tool. But two, it's plausible to think that there are some responses to the Evil God Challenge that might have some import on the gap problem. That's something that can be looked at, that maybe some people will look at later. But I think it's plausible to think there might be something going on there.
I think that's right. I mean, one of the first things that I watched on the gap problem was actually a debate between Dr. Glenn Peoples and Dr. Stephen Law. Did you guys ever watch that? It was on Unbelievable. It happened a while back. That was when Glenn Peoples was still doing like apologetic stuff. But they basically talked about for a while the moral argument. And so you could think of that, if there is a successful moral argument, that would help bridge the gap a little bit to the moral properties of this divine being. So yeah, I mean, any solution, I can see what you're kind of saying there, Perry, with like, if you do have a solution to the Evil God Challenge, then it would actually kind of help plug that gap.
I was thinking something about this. I haven't developed this, but there was this really smart and really good looking philosopher who wrote this paper called The Proper Basicality of the Belief in God and the Evil God Challenge. His name was Perry Hendricks. And he said, something like, well, if theism is true, belief in God's probably rational due to these considerations from Reformed epistemology. But if maltheism is true, belief in evil God's probably going to be irrational. Because you want to promote unjustified beliefs because justification's good and you want to maximize evil. And if that's the case, then belief in evil God is going to be irrational whether or not maltheism is true. So there's a real sense in which theism is reasonable and maltheism isn't. And the thought is maybe you can take the response to evil God there and apply that to all sorts of non-perfect beings. It's not going to get you the whole way, but it could rule out a large portion, maybe all beings that are indifferent or worse, or all beings that are slightly good or worse. I haven't developed that at all, but I think that's possible that could apply a little bit.
I can see that. This actually would be a good segue. I was going to pass it back over to Justin to kind of flesh out how, if you do have a solution to the gap problem, how would that work as a solution to the evil God challenge? The one that you
Sure.
give, I think, principally is Richard Swinburne's. Do you think that would be a good one to kind of lay out here?
Yeah, we could do that really quick.
Okay.
So Swinburne appeals to simplicity to try to deal with a version, at any rate, of the gap problem. His thought is like, okay, so there are all kinds of different things in principle that could be the cause of the universe, but God is the simplest possible. Yeah, I think that's right. Simplest possible cause of the universe. And he's got a number of points that he makes in defense of this view. Mostly what he does is he appeals to scientific practice. He looks at the way that scientists reason about when they compare hypotheses that are empirically equivalent, and how they decide, like, well, which one that they're going to go with or prefer over another. And it's always true that there are this is a well-known problem in the philosophy of science, that there are always infinitely many hypotheses that are compatible with any empirical data you have. And so if we're ever going to believe that any scientific hypothesis is true, we have to have some way of discerning between these empirically equivalent hypotheses. And so Swinburne looks at the way scientists do this, and he has a certain view about the method that they use. He thinks they use certain kinds of simplicity to decide between hypotheses that are otherwise kind of tied. And then what he wants to do is say that theism is very simple in exactly those sorts of ways. So, for example, theism says that there's just one thing that caused the universe, and that's a kind of simplicity known as ontological parsimony. And theism says that that thing has unlimited degrees of properties like knowledge and power rather than limited degrees. And Swinburne thinks that when you look in the history of science, you can see scientists gravitating toward unlimited degrees of certain properties until empirical evidence forces them towards a finite value. But the key move that Swinburne makes for our purposes is how he argues that God is morally perfect. And the way he does that is this. He says, look, if you got a being that's all powerful and all knowing, that being will always know what is the best thing to do in any situation, and it will always be able to do the best thing. And he thinks, therefore, that being will do the best thing in any situation unless there's some non-rational force that affects it, that motivates it to do something else. And that could be like a desire, right? So we have desires, and so that's why we don't always do the best things, because sometimes we have our desires motivate us to do what we know is not the best thing, and sometimes we give in to that, right? So Swinburne says, look, if an omnipotent and omniscient being is going to ever do anything that's less than best, that must mean it's subject to non-rational influences like desires. But it's simpler to suppose that it's not, that it isn't subject to any of those influences, that it doesn't have desires. And that's simpler because you're putting less in this being, so to speak. There's a whole kind of entity, desires, that you're saying it doesn't have in its mind. Or certain kinds of properties, like the properties of having certain desires, that you're saying it doesn't have rather than that it does. And so that, Swinburne thinks, that's simpler. And if it doesn't have desires, then it will always do what's best. And if it always does what's best, then it's good. In fact, it's perfectly good. So Swinburne then thinks the simplest kind of being that could cause the universe is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good. That's roughly what he says. I've simplified it in certain ways, but that's basically the outline.
Yeah, and we're just trying to see how this would actually be used as a response to the evil God challenge. So I thought it was important. You guys pointed out in the paper that it's important to note that you don't have to necessarily assume that this is a good account, or like this is a good solution to the gap problem. We're just trying to see if this does work. It's conditional. Yeah. If it does work, then it would be a solution to the evil God challenge.
Yes.
So then make that connection.
Yeah. So the connection is like this. Look, suppose we grant that the problem of good and the problem of evil are equally strong. And suppose we also grant that all the arguments for theism equally support maltheism. They don't give us any reason to favor God over evil God. Well, instead of concluding, oh, well, then we have no better reason to think God exists than evil God exists, which is what a defender of the evil God challenge does, we can bring in Swinburne's point, and we can say, well, wait a minute, but good God is simpler than evil God. And simpler hypotheses, other things being equal, are more likely to be true than more complex hypotheses. So we actually do have a reason to favor good God over evil God, even granting all of those other steps in the evil God challenge. That's the rough idea.
Perry, any other thoughts? I thought you kind of wanted to come in, but maybe you don't.
No, that's accurate. That was a good description of Swinburne's view. And yeah, if we can find a way to, maybe one way to picture it is this: like if you have two people off at the races, we can think of that if the intrinsic probability of theism sort of gets theists out of the gate quicker than the maltheists. And so if the evidence is the same, but theists start ahead, it can still provide a lot more reason to endorse theism over maltheism in that way. Does that make that clear?
I like that analogy. So like if both horses are like equal in speed, then the one that gets like if one is has better acceleration, then they would still win in the end.
Or if one starts ahead by like 100 yards. And in this case, theism starting ahead due to an increase in intrinsic probability and maltheism having a lower intrinsic probability.
Yeah. And so that's how a solution to the gap problem would thereby be a solution to the evil God challenge, or at least respond to it and give us a reason to think that God is perfectly good as opposed to perfectly evil.
Yeah. Let's put it this way. So theism. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, so if we have a solution to the gap problem, that means you have a reason to prefer theism to non-theistic alternatives. One of those non-theistic alternatives is maltheism. And so we have a reason to sort of put theism ahead in the race of probability over maltheism, and because maltheism is one of all the alternatives.
Justin, did you want to say something else, or we can move this point if you'd like. We can move to discussing some other solutions to the gap problem that have been offered in the literature and just kind of survey them. Basically, we're not going to get into a whole lot of detail because that's not the purpose of this show. Maybe if you guys are interested, let me know in the comments if you'd like to see a whole show kind of explaining these a little bit more in depth. Justin, I have a feeling you might be interested in coming back on to do that maybe after you're done moving and stuff. But if you guys would like for us to take a deeper look into that, I'd totally be happy to. But at this point, just because for the nature of this show and just how much time we have, let's maybe just survey them, and then Justin, give me like your top one or two that you think are defensible.
Sure. Yeah. I'll tell you about some of the other gap problem solutions in the literature, but I'll just give you the gist of it to keep it quick. So we just saw Swinburne's solution. Paul Draper has a version of Swinburne's solution. Now, Draper is either an atheist or an agnostic. I'm not sure how he describes himself these days. So he's not interested. Well, at any rate, he doesn't argue that God exists, but he has taken Swinburne's approach to thinking about the prior probability of theism and kind of given a different spin on it. That's sort of interesting. He thinks that Swinburne's appeal to simplicity is reducible to a different criterion of theory selection that he calls coherence. And coherence involves, among other things, privileging uniformity. And so Draper thinks, look, hypotheses that attribute more uniformity to the world are, other things being equal, more intrinsically probable than hypotheses that don't. And he thinks that...
Can you slow down just a second and explain what you mean by that? Hypotheses that attribute uniformity to the world?
Yeah, so think about, let's see, so uniformity is just like sameness of, properties of a certain sort, which I won't get into that technicality, but it's like, look, all ravens are black. That's a uniformity, whereas some ravens are black and some aren't is less uniform, right? Or it attributes less uniformity to the world than the claim that all ravens are black. And Draper thinks that theism is actually quite uniform in terms of what it attributes to God, because it doesn't say that God knows some things and not others, but that God knows everything, right? It's not that God can do some things and not others, but God can do everything, and so on. So he kind of just follows Swinburne, but says you can rethink Swinburne's approach in terms of uniformity. So that's an interesting approach. Also, Callum Miller has an approach that appeals to simplicity as well, to try to argue that theism is or has a high intrinsic probability, and so he's got a paper that's kind of in this same neighborhood. And then
Callum Miller, by the way, if you guys are interested, he does a lot of pro-life work these days. That's kind of like what he mainly does. So that's why his name hasn't really popped up recently in the philosophical literature. I don't know if you knew that, Justin, but that's mainly what he does now.
Okay. Yeah. So, all right. So you have these people who are appealing to things like simplicity and uniformity and so forth. And then there are people who talk about limits. So the main person here is Josh Rasmussen, who has an approach to the gap problem that focuses on limits understood as like finite values of degree properties. So like specific sizes and shapes and degrees of power and things like that are all, if they're finite, they're limits. And Rasmussen defends what's sort of like a principle of sufficient reason, or something kind of in the neighborhood of a principle of sufficient reason, to the effect that limits have explanations. And then he uses this to conclude that the fundamental explanation of all of reality has no limits. And then he tries to argue from there that this unlimited thing is going to be a thing with the traditional divine attributes, right? Having things like unlimited knowledge and power and value. So that's another approach that's out there. Interestingly, Ted Poston has an approach that has some similarities to this. It was published in Faith and Philosophy a few years ago, where he argues that theories that have no brute limits, no unexplained limits, are much more intrinsically probable than theories that do have unexplained limits. So there's another person out there defending something that's at least kind of like what Rasmussen is doing, although I don't think it's quite the same. And then finally, there's this approach that was developed by Ryan Byerly, and then I actually developed it a little bit further in a follow-up paper that talks about the explanatory power of universal generalizations. And universal generalizations are just claims of the form all A's are B's. So like all ravens are black is a universal generalization. And what Byerly points out is we tend to think that universal generalizations can explain things that we observe or discover, and that they are good explanations often. So if I see a bunch of black ravens and I wonder, why are all the ravens that I've seen black? It seems like one pretty good explanation is, well, because all ravens are black. And then Byerly wants to say, well, you can kind of do the same thing with God, because if you arrive at the conclusion that there's a cause of the universe that has some of the divine attributes, some of the perfections, you can ask, well, why have we found that it has these perfections? And one seemingly pretty good answer would be, well, because it has all the perfections. And so anyway, that's another approach that's out there.
Yeah, and you've developed that in your paper. What is it? Published in 2019, I believe. And it's actually a pretty short paper, so I liked it. I like how short it was. I mean, you don't often see papers that short these days.
Yes. And we did an interview on it, I think, on your podcast a number of years ago.
Yeah, that was years ago at this point.
Yes.
Well, so which one of these do you think has the most promise, or do you like the best?
Yeah, so I actually really like Draper's point that a lot of appeals to simplicity turn out to be at bottom appeals to kinds of uniformity. And I think he thinks this too, in a certain sense, or to some extent, though I might go a little bit farther than him. I don't know. I think actually a lot of our non-deductive reasoning is uniformity privileging reasoning. So I kind of like Draper's sort of take or twist on Swinburne. I also do have a soft spot for the Byerly approach because I've published on it and developed it a little bit. And
it seems
I
like
think
if I can kind of pause a little bit to comment on the Draper point about uniformity, it seems like there's actually a lot of overlap between that and Rasmussen's argument from limits. Do you see similarity there as well? Because Josh, I think would accept or think that's sort of right, that you don't have a being that has like some perfections or is unlimited in some ways, but then limited in other ways, at least at the fundamental level, right? Because someone like Josh is a Trinitarian, and so some people have pointed out that actually the Trinity seems to conflict with this thesis. So we're talking about sort of fundamental limits, but it seems like Draper and Josh would kind of be on the same page with this. They think that fundamentally it's going to be uniform at that level.
Yes. So I actually think that all of the gap problem solutions that I just mentioned have a lot in common with each other. And one thing I've noticed is that when you read these people, they each have their own like emphasis, but in addition to their main emphasis, they tend to also bring up ideas which are emphasized by the other approaches. So like someone who mostly talks about simplicity will sometimes speak in terms of limits, and vice versa. And someone who talks in terms of like unexplained limits will sometimes also talk in terms of, things like uniformity or simplicity. Yeah. So I actually think there's a lot of overlap here, and I'm not sure about this, but I'm tempted by the thought that really what's happening here is these are all just different attempts to think about how it is that we evaluate explanatory hypotheses, especially when they're empirically equivalent. And all of them, or at least all of the ones that we've mentioned so far, favor theism over things like maltheism. And so there's this question of, well, which one is the right way or the best way of thinking about comparing these hypotheses? But what's not a question is, will it turn out that theism is favored over maltheism? Because on all of them, theism is favored over maltheism. Or at least you might think so.
Perry, we haven't. You've been silent for a while. Just looking there, just stunner over there in the bot. What's going on?
I'm just the eye candy. Well, I think that doesn't work. I'm like the eye sore candy or something like that. But I mean, I think if I can't go against Draper.
Well, I mean, people don't know that. People don't know that you're a graduate from Purdue, and that's where Draper teaches. So,
yeah. I mean, I think that Draper's stuff is great on this, and then so I like that approach. I also like Swinburne's. I guess there's none of those approaches that strikes me as implausible, but if you force me to choose, I might have to go with something like Swinburne, I guess. But none of them are implausible, but I think Swinburne's is at least the most plausible.
Well, maybe we can wrap up the show with, well, first let me mention that if you guys want to read the paper that we've been talking about, I've got it linked in the description of this video if you guys want to go check it out. But also, we talked earlier, like, is it typical that theists they think that the evil God hypothesis is irrational? Let me ask you guys this. Why do you believe that God is good as opposed to evil? Mm-hmm. Perry, we'll start with you.
Oh, you're asking me? I thought that was a question directed towards the audience.
No, this is to you. Why do you personally, so this is going to be kind of autobiographical, why do you personally think that God is good as opposed to evil?
Well, I mean, reasons stemming from some of these gaps, solutions to the gap problem are a big part of it. I think that theism is a lot simpler than maltheism and therefore more probable. I also do think that belief in evil God would be irrational because the probability of my belief that evil God exists would be reliably produced is low or inscrutable, and either way, it would be irrational. So those are reasons that I think it is irrational to think or wrong. I think that God is not evil. And I think, the simplest kind of explanation is going to turns out to be one where God is good and not evil. So, I mean, the answer here is that I think solutions to the gap problem are correct. And that's why I think that God is good and not evil.
Yeah, it's super weird, though, that I didn't hear you mention that there's just a lot of good in the world, and that's why you don't think that there's an evil God. It's really strange. I don't know that I believe you. Like, I was expecting that to be the first thing you said, because typically that's what people say.
I only say that first if I'm not on camera, but since I'm on
Oh,
camera.
okay. Or if you just happen to be a student in Stephen Law's classroom. Justin, why do you think, let's turn it over to you. Why do you think that God is good as opposed to evil?
Yeah, I think two things. One is you might say like the disjunction of those solutions to the gap problem that we just reviewed. I think that something in that neighborhood is right, and therefore theism is more probably true than maltheism. And then secondly, I belong to
Real
a
quick,
religious.
real quick, you just used a big word. Not everyone that watches this is it like a native English speaker. Disjunction, all that means is that like this or that, A or B or C or D. So disjunction is different than conjunction. Conjunction would just be like and this and that. So you're saying like one of those is probably true.
Yeah, one of those, or at least something very like one of those, is probably true. And for that reason, theism, I think, is more probable than maltheism. And then also, I belong to a religious tradition which says that God is good. And I think there are some reasons to think that that religious tradition is true. And so evidence for that religious tradition is indirectly evidence that God is good rather than evil.
Nice. All right. What are you guys currently working on that we can get excited about?
Yeah.
Let me mention this too, because Perry he's probably most well known for his stuff on skeptical theism, which is a different type of response to the problem of evil. So, I mean, if you can't think of anything that you're like currently working on that's exciting, Perry, you can at least mention like you're basically the GOAT when it comes to skeptical theism, at least for people that are under the age of accountability.
So when you say most well known, you mean like more than 5 people, like 5 or 6 people have read know about it. But what am I working on? Oh yeah, so I had a book on skeptical theism come out a few months ago, creatively titled Skeptical Theism. I'm supposed to be writing a book against diversity statements, which I need to get done soon. I'm not sure.
Oh, you know what we should actually talk about is the fact that your paper was rejected. Let me rephrase it. It was accepted, then it was, what was it called? Like under review again,
rescinded,
and then it was rejected.
Yeah, so it was accepted. I wrote a paper on abortion, and it was accepted and then put on hold, and the acceptance was rescinded. So that's something I'm not doing right now. And we'll see how that turns out, though. That'll be interesting. I don't know if I have any other interesting. I have a few other projects I'm working on, but I don't know if they're interesting. Most of what
riveting.
I do isn't.
This is riveting, Perry.
That's what they call me, riveting Perry.
Okay, what about you, Justin? Maybe you got some more interesting things going on.
Yeah, so I'm working on actually pretty close to finishing a book about material object metaphysics, but maybe more interesting to the people who watch this channel. I've just finished kind of like a year-long research project on karma and reincarnation. And so I've got a couple of papers on that, which I'm going to try to publish over the next year or two. But that's been fun to think about.
Interesting. Have you talked with Seth Hart at all about this?
I have not.
Do you even know who that is? Okay.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, he's been on the channel to talk about reincarnation. I think he's either finishing up or did receive his doctorate. But you should definitely check Seth Hart out. I've had him on. If you guys are interested in reincarnation, you can go look in the previous catalog of videos with Seth Hart on that topic. He even did a debate with someone who does believe in reincarnation, even lives in India and stuff. So it was really interesting conversation. But that's cool. We should try to do some more work together. That'd be awesome.
Sure.
I guess on several things.
I just remembered one project I am working on that is actually interesting. I'm co-editing a book on Paul Draper's philosophy. We got contributors are like Michael Tooley, Richard Swinburne, Graham Oppie, Michael Bergman, Charity Anderson, Nevin Kleimenhaga. Lots of it's going to be awesome. That is one thing that I think I'll produce that'll be worthwhile.
Nice. Is it so that's an edited book, right?
It's going to be
different essays.
Yeah, and it's going to have a response from Draper to his critics. So it's going to be like Naturalism Defeated, if you know what that book is, where we're planting a
Yes.
response to his critics. But so that'll be cool. That'll be within the next couple of years.
Nice. Sweet. So overall, the point of this video is the Evil God Challenge has potentially already been solved many years ago.
Maybe we can put it this way: like the Evil God Challenge doesn't pose a challenge to theism beyond the gap problem.
All right, guys. Perry, Justin, appreciate you guys coming back on. As I mentioned, I do have more information about my guests below, linked in the description. If you guys want to go check them out. Thank you guys for tuning in. I'll see you in the next Capturing Christianity video. See you guys later.
Yep. See ya.
All right.
I don't think he was saying see you to you. That's to the audience.
What'd you say? What'd you say?
You were saying see you to the audience, and then Justin said see you back. Or was that a see you to us?
It was to you, yeah.
No,
Okay.
he was saying to the audience.
I was saying see you later to the audience.
Oh.
I thought he was talking to the audience. That's why I didn't pick up on it at all.
Oh,
Oh,
well,
okay.
I think it'll work either way. Nice. Okay.